You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Welcome back. We're here to talk all about sequencing, one of our favorite topics to discuss. I think there's a lot of great conversations that'll come. And we also have our sequencing training going live coming up really soon. And if you can't make it live, if you miss a live deadline, we also run it as an evergreen course. So if you're interested in more tools, that's always a resource. But we're going to try and jumpstart you with some good information and resources, considering that most people watching this and listening are already teaching yoga or maybe interested in teaching yoga. And there's a lot of great things that we can do just in a podcast. Of course, anything can be discussed in a longer conversation.
The sequencing is one that for me just comes up again and again and again because it's such a big part of teaching. It's such a huge part of how we show our personalities and, put our own stamp on the practice. It's a big part of how we communicate with students what's important to us and what excites us and what challenges us. And it's also it can be a really big time suck as a teacher. I know I've told this story before, but I remember so many nights back when I was teaching, 15 to 20 classes a week of sitting with a blank piece of paper at 11 o'clock at night, racking my brains as to what I was going to do tomorrow that was fun or fancy or different or creative. And, so many late nights to bed trying to figure out this sequencing thing. And so I think that's why it's a topic that we keep coming back to. It's a really big part of teaching. And if you don't have an efficient process, it can also really ruin your life as a teacher, or at least make it hard.
It's true. And I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves as teachers, especially now with everyone online and the expectations growing. I think sometimes on teachers, I think we put a lot of expectations on ourselves to show up with the perfectly sequenced class and to impress people with our sequences. And I think there's something to that. I know for myself, I think for me personally, sequencing can be a creative outlet. However, it can also become this thing that kind of takes over when I feel like I have to, like any creative, like you have to produce something new and unique and creative every time. But when you just let yourself go and find what is enjoyable to me in the moment, that might be certain poses or certain postures or types of poses or tools or cues or, certain demographics that I've been working with that have really benefited from, or people I've been working with as clients who have been struggling with some certain injury. I think all of those things, the things that are interesting to you are for me what really drive interesting classes. So yeah, I agree. We start with this topic from, it's a really important topic, I think, as yoga teachers, because it can be one that uplifts us and feeds us and helps draw people to us as a teacher. And it can be also something that really drains us and wears us down and feels like a burden.
And we've done a previous episode on creating sequences in a way that's kind of efficient, working smarter, not harder, was what we called that episode. So I will link to that in the show notes. Today, we're kind of exploring some of the pitfalls that you can fall into when you get excited about sequencing or struggle with sequencing, no matter how experienced you are. And I've drawn, definitely the ones I'll be talking about, I have drawn from the pitfalls that I fall into on a regular basis. Still, after teaching thousands of classes, there are lots of things that I continue to, muck up a little bit. So that's the topic for today, looking at some of those common mistakes that we all make.
And I think it's one of those things too. I think it's helpful to look at these common mistakes and know that, like a lot of rules, we at Yoga Medicine really believe in many ways that you learn the rules so you can also break them, because there are also exceptions to them as well. And you'll see that as we go through this. If I have a clear purpose in mind, I feel like most of these rules can be broken. However, as I'm beginning or trying to create some framework for my teaching, I think sticking to them can be helpful.
100%. Or if you're breaking them with a really clear purpose. And so you have to kind of know the purpose and know the rule first to realize that you're even breaking it. Yes.
So the first one, timing. Timing is everything. And I think we all know that a really well balanced class can feel really nice. However, there are certain contexts where maybe I'll have a longer cool down or a longer warm up or a longer kind of middle part of the practice. And generally speaking, I think having those three components, the beginning, the middle, and the end. So like for me, I think of the beginning as the preparation for what's to come. That might be isolated movements, it might be MFR, it might be visualization or meditation, even potentially.
Breath
Um,
work, embodiment practices.
yeah, so
Yeah.
many. There's so many things you could put in that category, but really what it is doing is it's preparing me for the challenges that come in the second phase of the practice. And then I'm kind of expanding those tools and challenging my body to apply those in more advanced scenarios or more movement-based scenarios or static scenarios. And then at the end, the cool down is kind of balancing everything out. If I've done a whole lot of one part of the body, that might be just working on a different part of the body. If I've done a lot of strength work on one part, maybe I'm now releasing it or doing MFR on it. So finding a way to create balance and between those three parts and the timing. And, I think we see this a lot, in the 200 hour of,
Mm-hmm.
that, and most, I think, new teachers experience this as did we. Is like making a class plan and just running out of time. And you just
Yeah.
keep going and you keep going, you keep going. And then, oh, shoot, you're still in your flow and it's time to stop.
Yeah. And then you have this horrible choice of, do I carry on and then we run over? Which many teachers take that option. I personally don't, because I've been caught out before, rolling out of Shavasana, looking at my watch and realizing I'm 20 minutes late for something that was really important to me. So option one, you run over. Option two, you shortchange Shavasana, which is just as bad in a different way. So yeah, in the sequencing training, we kind of offer a general framework of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So if your class is 60 minutes, 20 minutes in, roughly, you want to be wrapping up your warm up. 40 minutes in, roughly, you want to be wrapping up your body of the class and heading toward the cool down. And it's not that you're a slave to your watch and you stop halfway through and go to the next part of the plan. It just gives you markers in your mind so that you can be feeling whether, I'm running a little slow. I might drop out a couple of things that I had in mind so that I can move on to the next piece, or I'm running a little quick. Great, we can take a bit more time here. It just gives you markers before you get to 55 minutes that let you know in advance how you're tracking compared to time. And as you were saying, Tiffany, this is not a hard and fast. If I'm teaching an early morning class, I'll usually spend a lot longer on the warm up phase and I will peak later because I don't want to make people drowsy and sleepy and then send them off to work. And if I'm teaching an evening class and people come kind of heightened and full of energy and, after fighting traffic or trying to get a park, I'm not going to do a really long leisurely warm up. I've got to meet their energy where it's at. And now that I teach on demand classes, if I'm doing a 15-minute class, I'm not necessarily doing 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes. So there are always exceptions. But when I'm teaching a general, well rounded group class, that's something I bear in mind, just so that I'm kind of watching how I'm going through and I've got time to make adjustments on the fly instead of getting to the time I should be in Shavasana and realizing I'm nowhere near there yet. And I have that horrible decision of running over or shortchanging Shavasana.
Yeah, I think it comes back to that purposeful element too. Like all of these themes really will. And teaching in person versus teaching online can be two very different topics. But
Mm-hmm.
when I'm teaching in person too, if I have a very clear purpose for my class, whatever that might be, if I'm getting to that kind of midpoint of class or to that 40-minute mark and I'm going, okay, there's a couple of really key concepts I really want to get to, I
Yes.
can take out a few, I can have um, a shorter kind of last cool down phase.
Mm-hmm.
And then I know when I'm getting there too, I'm probably just going to get them right into some things and maybe be quiet a little quicker. If I'm quiet quicker, it makes the time feel longer versus if I'm talking all through it and planting seeds for those long held postures, it can make the time feel shorter. So I can use my voice to kind of expand or collapse time as well. And know that again, if my purpose is kind of in that core element I'm still getting to at that 40-minute point, like maybe I do want to go a little bit over that, but know that I do want to kind of then focus in on the most important things so that I don't run 20 minutes over for people and
Yeah.
have them upset.
Yeah.
And
Really important tips in there that I want to make sure people didn't miss. The first one is when you've got that really clear focal point and intention, not every pose or practice is equally important to that intention. So you can leave some things out without detracting from the overall learning experience. And that's where having that clarity of focus really helps you decide which is the stuff that you leave out today, or which is the stuff that you add in today that reinforces your theme. And the second part was, and this is not something I think people teach in teacher training, is that you can concertina time, you can stretch it out and you can shorten it by either holding silence or interjecting cues. And that's such a powerful tool to have in your toolkit. 5 breaths in pigeon where you don't say a word feels like 3 minutes.
Yeah. And, I think, for example, if my focus, if my theme is some kind of mechanical challenge or muscular challenge, I'm probably going to spend maybe a little bit more time in the preparation and the challenge and maybe have a little shorter cool down versus if nervous system regulation, or maybe just calm or something like that in general is my focus, maybe I'll have a shorter kind of preparation and maybe a medium or shorter challenge and spend a longer time in that cool down and recovery. And like you said, especially if that's like a 6:30 p.m. class or something, where I want to leave people in that really like down regulated state, that
Mm-hmm.
calm, relaxed state for the end of day. And the great thing about doing it online is we can bend time a lot. Like I don't have to end at that certain time, so I could make it a longer or shorter class depending on what's really important to me. But again, I do want to be, for me, teaching online, the more challenging thing is that a lot of times people want quick classes when they're practicing online. So I
Mm-hmm.
am trying to really focus on the things that are most important. And so again, that might be 3 equal phases. That might be different based on what I just mentioned. But I do have a little bit more flexibility if it's online because people aren't waiting to drive home and do their things.
Yeah, and
So
it's
I
much
can really
easier for them
focus
to
on the
hit
purpose.
pause than it is for them to roll out of Shavasana and sneak out of a yoga studio.
Yes. Well, and they know what they're getting into because they can see the length. If it's not a live class, they can see the length
Right.
of the recorded session and know what they're in for and plan for that, which is nice. And so it gives me the luxury as a teacher to really focus on what's most important to me. So
Yeah. And that can really help you feel more confident because instead of you getting that, I've definitely had this before, this growing feeling of panic of I have my sequence, the sequence is set, I got to get through it faster because I'm running slow. It really helps you feel much more in control of the process of knowing, whether you're going to linger, whether you want to go through things more quickly, whether you want to add extra things in or take things out, whether you want to leave people quiet or interject cues. It just gives you more of a feeling of being in control of time as opposed to it controlling you.
and hopefully if you're one of those people who finds yourself in that state a lot, which I know I do, I used to always over plan my classes and
Yeah.
have too much. And at some point I realized, hey, okay, I can just relax and focus on having the most important things and I don't need to plan so much. And so,
Hmm.
you can cut yourself a little bit of slack when you're preparing and know that you don't need to prepare that much. And I think as you teach over the years too, you get a sense of that. Although, sometimes we're in the moment and, things kind of come up and, we start elaborating on things that might, feel useful, in the moment. I think as teachers, we're humans too. So some days we might be a little bit more likely to elaborate and others be more concise. So,
I do
but
think
for the most part, we
when
kind of
we'll
know how to plan.
We'll suggest later, or at least I will suggest later, that you practice your own sequence before you teach it, especially if you are newer to teaching. And I still think that's really important to do. But when you're practicing your own sequence, you usually go through it a lot more quickly than you do if you're talking people through it, because they, of course, don't know what you're thinking or what you're envisaging. You can just think warrior two and get to warrior two. It's definitely slower to talk people from downward facing dog to warrior two. So I think that's where a lot of newer teachers get into the habit of over planning because they've practiced their sequence, all of this stuff fitted into an hour. Great, there's my hour class. So you do have to be willing, I think, to remember that teaching is usually slower than doing, almost always. And so something that you practice that might take you 60 minutes is probably more like a 90-minute class. So leave in space, leave in room for the students to have their own experience. And if you finish a little early and students get a long shavasana, not many of them will complain. If you finish a couple of minutes early, not many students will complain. But that was a real journey for me to get to, of going, okay, the thing I plan will not take me an hour to practice. I've got to leave time for the students to find their way through it.
Yes, yes, I agree. It's a great reminder. And I think the next one is a really big one when we talk
Yeah.
about theming, and there's a lot of different directions under theming, but really important to us at Yoga Medicine because the theming is again that purpose-driven content. And to me, as both a teacher and as a practitioner and someone who trains teachers, I think it's really the most important part of sequencing is having a cohesive theme. And that theme could just be a well-rounded practice, a feel-good
Yes.
practice. It doesn't have to be fancy or elaborate or crazy. It could be a cue, it could be a part of the body or a pose, or a lot of different things. Or a philosophical theme. There can be many, many, many options for theming, but it's what creates cohesion, and I think allows students to have a really clear experience and cohesive kind of takeaway moments too that can be really potent. I think for me, this is what makes the practice really powerful, is having that
Mhm.
cohesiveness to it.
For me too, when I'm practicing a class, if it just feels like a series of things that a teacher pulled together, even if some of them are novel or interesting and I steal them for later, it doesn't create the same depth of experience of they wanted me to have a feeling of simplicity, or they wanted me to feel the difference when I have a strong back leg, or they wanted me to feel expansive in the heart. And all of the ways that they touched onto that idea through the practice gives it resonance, gives it meaning, gives it depth. And I do think that's what people come to yoga for, as opposed to, doing another movement class at the gym. They're looking for that depth of experience, that feeling of
Absolutely.
connecting with something a little bit deeper than just I put my foot here and I put my hand here.
Mic drop. Like that's
Yeah.
all we need to say right there. And I couldn't have said it better. I think it's so true. It really
Mm.
is what unifies it and makes it yoga and not just a fitness class, because there is a lot of overlap and a lot of yoga being used in fitness classes, which is great. I have no
Yeah.
problem. I think that's a
We
wonderful
like
thing. But
fitness.
landing, yeah, landing in a yoga practice should feel like you're landing in your body and some kind of cohesive experience. And I agree with you. Like, yeah, it's great to go to a class when someone has like just this smattering of like creative things or different things. But if you can take that, which you and I both love to do, we love to go to a lot of other people's classes, and I love those moments because I can take them then and use them in a way that's really cohesive and put it together in a way that's meaningful. And honestly, as a teacher, you get to decide what you put out there, and it will affect who you draw to you. I think so. Are you drawing those people who just want like a whole bunch of new stuff all the time, or are you drawing people who want a meaningful experience to in their bodies and to feel good?
Mm.
There's not a right or wrong answer there.
And as we talk about in the sequencing course, it also makes the process of sequencing a lot easier, because instead of you just looking at a blank sheet of paper or a blank computer screen or however you sequence your classes going, I, I don't know, what do I put in? It starts to guide you right away. What things give me the feeling of X? What poses or practices make me feel the strength in the back leg or the lack of strength in the back leg? What things to me speak to simplicity? Whatever your guiding point is, it starts to generate ideas for you. It sort of narrows down this family of things and probably not that family of things. And it starts to shape the sequence for you instead of you just having to pull stuff out of thin air.
Yeah, and it really begins that process, the process that we take you through in the sequencing training too, to
Mm.
be able to craft and build a sequence. Which just having this information from the podcast, I think, is a really great start to that. But what we're talking about is just having a theme, having some kind of
Hmm.
uniting principle. And I think this is interesting too, because what I love about this in the moments in my career where I've been able to teach um, local classes and have a community of people that I taught to several times a week or more, and could watch over time grow. What I love about that is that their knowledge base builds, and I think one person might come up. Maybe you'll do I'm just going to pick something. Let's say you did a rotator cuff class, something just strictly more anatomical. And people come up to you, maybe one or two people, like, that was so helpful. you didn't do a private lesson with them. You didn't run through an evaluation like we teach in our orthopedic modules or something like that, but you found a really helpful gift for them, which is a really valuable thing. And so, that can be a moment in time that's really valuable to remind them to come back to those principles in another class. And I love those moments, too, those learning moments for people to find what's helpful for them, because no one group class can speak to everyone, can support everyone in the same way. But over time, if I'm picking different parts of it, some anatomical, some philosophical, some, more nuanced, and some more just simple, well-rounded, over time, everyone starts to get to learn kind of like the owner's manual of their body, and find those little nuances that are helpful to maybe bring into other practices. Because a lot of times these might just be cues. It might not be pose specific things that they could bring into another group class that could be helpful for them. And they learn how to move their body. They learn how to connect with their body. They learn how to, you know, speak to it in different ways, which I think is really valuable over time.
I think of this as drip feeding curriculum. It's like you're
Yes.
teaching, a master's degree, but you're just doing it one little nugget at a time. Yeah. So if the first pitfall is not enough of a theme or not enough of a kind of guiding anchor to your practice, the flip side of it is too much of a good thing. You get so carried away with your theme that there's no room for anything else. It's all rotator cuff all the time. You're strengthening, you're stretching. People don't even have legs. It's just about the shoulder. And that too can be an unsatisfying experience for a student. Firstly, because it can feel physically and mentally unbalanced. My shoulders are shattered and I don't even have hips or legs. Yes. Mentally taxing and physically taxing. And also you run the risk of, not everybody came with rotator cuff issues. Not everybody came looking to focus on their shoulders. So you run that risk of not speaking broadly enough to everybody in the room. So something that we've suggested in the previous podcast and that we suggest in the training actually is that you have a really rough kind of template that you follow. Your classes are to some extent a familiar pattern for students. And instead of every single thing, every cue, every pose, every practice relating to today's theme, you pepper that in, leaving enough space for students to have an experience of being in their bodies, connect to their breath, and they're more likely then to have attention left over to take in the new thing, the new cue, or the variation on the warm-up that you do that focuses on the rotator cuff. You're still working their legs, you're still talking to their hips and their spine, you're still referencing the breath, but you're just dropping in these repeated references, these repeated experiences of the part of the body or the philosophical focal point or whatever your intention was, in a way that's a bit more digestible. So instead of feeding them with a fire hydrant, you're drip feeding, and they're more likely to be able to take the information in. And if it's not something that's of interest of them, they're more likely to just let it be part of this well-rounded experience.
Yeah, I agree. And so it's not too much, it's not too little. It's just right. It's the Goldilocks scenario. And I just got back from teaching the yoga for athletes in Berlin, and I think with athletes it's even more so. And beginners. I always joke and say
Yes.
teaching athletes is like teaching really tight beginners. It's the same thing. And you really want that familiarity regardless of who you're teaching, especially with beginners, especially with athletes. I want to have that familiarity and then sprinkle in some newness and know that some people will be interested in that theme and some won't. And so I need to keep things moving. In our teacher trainings, I'm always saying that, like, learning how to, one of the things we often do in our teacher trainings is whatever the curriculum is asking our teachers then to go practice explaining these concepts, these new concepts to people, because that's a great way to learn. It's a great tool in any learning curriculum. Because as soon as I can teach it, I now know it on a different level. But then the next phase as yoga teachers is, first I just have to know it and be able to explain it. But then in a yoga class, I have to be so succinct. Because I'm dropping, like you said, drip feeding these cues and these ideas, and knowing that some people will be interested and some won't. And I also don't want to talk so much that I take them out of their own experience and their own body, because that can just be a lot just to talk all the time. So it's also that balance, that middle path, that Goldilocks scenario of all of it.
And to me too, when you get this right, and I don't always, so don't come at me, people. When you get this right, it's also more restful for you as a teacher because the pressure isn't to teach these people everything about the rotator cuff in this one class today, like they're going to take a
Mm.
test at the end of class. It's just, I'm offering a couple of helpful ideas. And if I run out of time to cover everything I wanted to cover, there's next week or next month or next year. The pressure is off. It doesn't all have to happen today. And that, to me, as a teacher, is also really calming. It also kind of takes the weight of the world off my shoulders. I'm not trying to do everything now. I'm just offering a couple of things, and there's plenty of time to do more later.
I think that part's so important. It can't be overemphasized. I know we say this a lot in the orthopedic modules. You teach the hip and the shoulder with me, and you know, people are always so excited to go home, and they've like, completely
Mind
revamped their
blown.
understanding of these joints and how, they might be helping students relate to these postures and move through these postures in different ways. And, it can be overwhelming because you want to go home and you want to do it all and change it all. And, and you really have to start just a little bit at a time and finding ways we're trying to optimize the human experience, both physically, mentally, emotionally, energetically. And so these things happen over time. I think as a healthcare provider too, the greatest impacts that we have on our health and well-being are the small things that we can do over time, the cues that we plant that people can come back to in another yoga class, not the big fancy posture that we can get them into in the one class.
Yeah. And I think this really leads me into the final pitfall that's related to theming, which is picking the wrong theme. And this is something I've definitely done before, especially fresh out of a teacher training when I've just had my mind blown. And I want to bring all of this really nuanced information back to my students. And I forget that they aren't all teachers. They haven't all done hundreds of hours of anatomy study. Not all of them have been practicing for 40 years and, know the basics and are ready to really dive into the nitty gritty detail. So you really do have to pick a theme that isn't just of interest to you, but has some relevance and application to your students. So that's where you might be inspired by, as you said, Tiffany, a client that you're working with or a really common problem that students come to you with, or you take that really nitty gritty piece of theory and you look at its application in real life, in daily life. So there is a little bit of trial and error here, but you don't want to be talking to beginners about something super subtle or people who aren't fascinated by the practice of yoga about a really minute detail of alignment. You want to make it relevant to the people that you're teaching.
Yeah, and I think this one is another great context when we talk about athletes too, or anyone. What I'm always doing as a yoga teacher is I have my topic that's interesting to me, and then I'm thinking about how would this be interesting to either a specific demographic like athletes that I'm talking to, or a specific sport, or a more broad demographic. So, I'll just take that rotator cuff example again. If I was like, maybe I was working with a bunch of clients or patients who had rotator cuff issues and wanting to bring this in, what's interesting about that to someone who doesn't have a rotator cuff injury? Well, finding resilience in the shoulders, having some strength and stability and, resilience, I think, in the shoulders is interesting. And the rotator cuff is a big part of that. So
Mm-hmm.
again, those are quick little sentences that I can use in a yoga class. I don't need to go into a lot of depth and detail, though. Maybe there are moments where I could drop a few lines in there to talk a little bit more about why that is or how that is. And for athletes, like we talked about this a lot in my athletes training recently, is how might something like, all these fascial concepts we talked about, like thixotropic and viscosity and viscoelasticity, how might these concepts be interesting to a cyclist or a runner or something specific? And so I have to take these very scientific words and distill them down into something that's interesting to me. If I'm on my bike, for hours every day, what is interesting to me? And then I have something that can be really useful, again, along this idea of helpful themes, maybe.
Yeah, we,
So
we talk about this in various different yoga medicine trainings about the Venn diagram between, what your expertise, what you're good at, plus what you're excited about and passionate about and exploring, plus what people actually need from you. And I think a theme falls into the middle of that Venn diagram really nicely, because it needs to be something that you know enough that you have some little nuggets to share. Ideally, you're interested in it enough to craft a class around it and to have things that you're excited to share with people. Excitement is so contagious, but it should also be relevant to the people in front of you. There needs to be some little thing that they can take away from it, whether it's in their practice or in their day or in their sport, that makes it feel relevant and worthwhile and useful and interesting.
Yeah. Yes. I
Yeah.
love that triad. It's such an
Yeah.
like an easy
Yeah.
one, and it can be cut and paste to so many things.
Yeah.
I love it. Yes.
So the next pitfall is also one that I've done before, and sometimes I do deliberately, which is too many similar poses in a row. So we're moving from the really big picture around getting your timing right and having a guiding principle to help you select poses and practices and share information that's really pertinent to the students, to the nitty gritty. So imagine you're in Utkatasana chair or fierce, and then you take one leg back behind you and you're in a bent knee warrior 3, and then you step the ball of the foot down very lightly and you're in a leaning forward crescent lunge or arrowhead, and then you turn the back toes out, plant the back heel, and you're in extended side angle. You can imagine if you're holding each one of those poses for a reasonable period of time, at some point your front leg is going to be talking to you much more loudly than whatever is your theme or focal point for the day. So I could be in that sequence of poses talking about the rotator cuff until I'm blue in the face. No one's thinking about their shoulder. They're thinking about the heat and the fatigue in that front leg. So you can do this intentionally. Maybe your theme is persistence or determination or perseverance or leg strength or leg endurance. But if you do it accidentally, you're likely to work in cross purposes with your theme, because what people are feeling fatigue is going to speak a lot more loudly than whatever intention you have in mind.
I agree. And I feel like if I'm going to do something like that as a challenge, which I think can
Mm-hmm.
be a healthy challenge,
Totally.
one, I do want to kind of know my demographic and know what is a healthy challenge for the people that I teach regularly. And of course, that's not going to be the same for every single person in class, but for kind of that mid range of class. Um, and then I usually like to let people know it's coming, like, here's
Yeah.
our challenge. I used to love to do this. Maybe I need to bring this back, but
Oh,
I used
no.
to love to do like a string of, 3 or 4 or 5 poses, depending on how similar they were. Maybe even 5 or 6, but 1-minute holds. And
Yes.
yes, you need to change that enough. You can't do the same position and the same muscle group over and over and over again like that. You can imagine I need to change my direction and my movement a bit so that it's possible. But I also need to know that toward the end of that, their muscles are going to start to be fatiguing. So I don't want to put them in compromising positions. Like
Mm-hmm.
one of the common ones is, to kind of progress and eventually get up on one leg and maybe be in something like half moon,
Mm-hmm.
and then coming down into warrior 2. When I'm really fatigued like that, controlling that movement over the hip joint can be really challenging. I think we've talked
Mm-hmm.
about this in previous episodes of
Yeah.
going from an external rotation to an internal rotation. And so there are some compromising positions that, just think about things that can be really challenging to articulate once your legs are fatigued, and you're probably on the right track, or things where people might fall,
Mm-hmm.
if they're really tired. So I'm just considering what's really reasonable and relevant for the majority of class, and letting them know that it's coming, and maybe giving them
Yes.
some outs, giving them
Yes.
some options too.
Yeah, and I think the intentionality is everything. I taught a class last week where the theme was work and rest. So we had periods where we were very deliberately engaging muscles and contracting them and leaning into the heat of it all, the tapas of it all. And then would come a rest. And the challenge was, can you find a level of challenge that pushes you a little? And then when you get to the rest phase, can you let that challenge dissolve, or are you still kind of holding on to it? Are you still gripping onto aspects of it? And I found that really fascinating. Don't know if all the students did, but that's the hard part. But yeah, both of them had their intentionality. It wasn't just, I happen to have you in plank for a minute and I'm not talking about that at all. You're just dying and wondering if I've forgotten that you're there. I'm holding you here and I'm talking to how hard it is, and I'm talking to the fatigue that's building and the muscles that are engaging. I'm making it feel like I've got you, I'm with you, I'm doing this deliberately. It has a purpose. And for the theme that I was doing, rest is coming. So can you stay in your version of this challenge, knowing that in a moment you will get to rest? That's quite a
Yeah.
different experience from we're in plank and I'm leaning against the wall telling them a story and they're still in plank. Yeah.
Yes.
Which
Yeah, and
I've probably also done.
I love that. I love that concept, and I love the minute long holds too are nice because if
Hmm.
I'm just linking a few poses together, I'm also letting them know, hey, there's only going to be 4 poses.
Yeah.
And I love linking it with breath. If you can do a 5 count inhale and a 5 count exhale, you've only got 6 breaths. So, and then I can also leave a little bit of stillness. So there's all these wonderful things. But again, if I were to just take people right into that without any explanation, the
Yeah.
first thing I would think as a student in class, especially if the person was walking around and helping people, was that they forgot about us. That's usually
Yeah.
my assumption.
They don't know how hard this is. They're not connected to the feeling I'm having in my body right now. And that's not a good thing as a teacher for students to be thinking, they don't
They've
know how
lost
I'm feeling.
our confidence, right? And our trust
Yes.
as a student.
Yes.
I'm like, okay, where are we going? What are we doing now? Did they forget about us? Are they lost in this other
Yes.
person? Anyway, so I think that purposefulness comes in the intentionality of letting them know sometimes what's coming. If there is a challenge,
Hmm.
if there are going to be several similar poses in a row, but generally speaking, having too many similar poses in a row can be a problem. So
Yeah. As can something we've hinted to already, which is sequencing purely for novelty, just looking for the new thing or the most unexpected thing or the weirdest thing or the fancy new thing that you've seen in another class or online. And like the previous one, this is something that I will sometimes do with intention. My theme for today is novel transitions or stability in new transitions. Can you find a way to support yourself when you're moving in a way that's unpredictable? Because for my students, that's going to be really important for fall prevention because falls usually happen when somebody's doing something awkward or unexpected. So you can do it deliberately, but you don't want to do it accidentally. You don't want to be teaching a class that is just every fancy new thing that leaves students behind, might leave them a little confused or bedazzled without that being your purpose for the class. It should always be useful, I think, first and foremost, and maybe newness comes a little bit further down the line.
I totally agree. And I think as a student, that familiarity is really important. We as teachers sometimes come to class looking for novelty and newness to teach in our own classes. But if we do
Mhm.
come to class for our own purposes, to feel good in our bodies, to get the most out of the practice, it really doesn't take a lot of fancy things. And yes, I think novelty can be really useful for a lot of reasons, for functional movements and balance and transitions and real life scenarios. However, there's so much to just the nuts and bolts of what we do that doesn't need a lot of fancy extra bits to it. But again, finding what's useful to me, I'm bringing in creative things because I've found them to be useful with myself, with my students or my patients, with other teachers or whoever that might be. To me, it's a useful resource for some reason. And to each their own. There are people who just love to do creative classes. And if that fulfills you, that's your thing. That's your theme is creativity. But I think a lot of teachers feel like they have to teach that way and end up feeling really worn down and forgetting that your students are there to feel their best. They want you to succeed as a teacher. They want to have a great experience and they don't necessarily need to have, we've all been in the studios where it seems like people want all the flashy stuff. Living in LA, I've seen a lot of those.
Mhm.
When I lived in LA, people who expect their like handstand quota. But I had my own following of people. None of them knew to expect that. They came for different reasons. And you draw those people to you. And again, if you love teaching handstands and creative stuff and that feeds you, that's great.
Mhm.
Continue it. But I think for most teachers, they feel like they have to fill a quota sometimes, and they keep trying to draw those same students back instead of just finding a way to teach to the people who have a similar interest. And again, just feeling good.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. If you're feeling that pressure to keep coming up with fancy new stuff, the way that I think about it in my head is a kind of 80-20. 80% of the class is familiar poses, cues, practices, because that in itself can be sort of soothing for people's nervous systems, just to know that this is somewhere they've been before. This is something they've done before. There's a less mentally taxing aspect to that. And then the 20% are the things that I'm introducing today that might be pose variations or arm positions or head and neck positions that today we're going to. And that also lets those things really shine against that background of familiarity. The couple of things that are fresh and new stand out. They feel purposeful. They're not exhausting for the students. You keep their trust, and you might just sneak in some education. You might teach them something. So that's the kind of general rule I like to follow.
And I totally agree. And as a teacher, for me, I find when I follow that rule, it leaves more space for me to inject the experience, which might often
Yeah.
be the silence, the stillness, the moments between, or those subtle cues, or the things that really make it a powerful class more than the actual poses sometimes. So
100%. And again, it makes it a less stressful experience for you as a teacher, because you're not trying to memorize the six different fancy little things that you were injecting into this class. You're just keeping that singular purpose in mind, and there's room for you to be looking around the room, noticing what people are doing and responding to it. There's room for you to leave quiet. There's, just more spaciousness around the experience for you as well as the students. So any
absolutely.
other big sequencing pitfalls that you wanted to explore before we kind of wrap up with some final advice?
So I think those were the big ones, right? I
Yeah.
think the other ones are just kind of quick takeaway things.
Hmm.
We've mentioned them already. Practice it before you teach it. I think that's one we drive home a lot, especially for newer teachers. And even teachers who've been teaching for a long time. For me, I'm teaching things that I've done in my own practice. And maybe, I'm putting it together in a slightly different way when I'm teaching it. Maybe I'm practicing exactly that sequence before I teach it. I mean, that might change over time as a teacher, but I've definitely practiced the components of that class and I
Hmm.
know them well. I've felt it in my body. I know the purpose behind it. And um, it's easy to teach from then. I don't have to think about it. I'm teaching from an experience and a feeling that I know in my body and a quality in my body potentially as well.
That's the key to me, is teaching from your body instead of teaching from your brain. Because when you've memorized a sequence and that's using up all of your brain space, you're not really there for the experience for your students. And I've had that
Yeah.
too, of just desperately remembering what pose comes next and what practice comes next. It's definitely a more natural and organic feeling for students when you're there with them in the feeling, as opposed to, I've got these all of these things that I've crammed in there that I can't lose focus on for a second, or they'll fall out my ears and I'll never have them again. So yeah, teaching from the feeling and not teaching from the thinking. And I also suggest that you keep your sequences and reuse them, because, and I wrote an article on this for Yoga Journal that I'll link to for those of you who are interested. You can take the exact same series of poses and make it a million different classes depending on how fast you go. Maybe you're doing Tiffany's 1 minute holds. Maybe you're just inhaling in one pose and exhaling to the other. Maybe you're flowing between them. You're inhaling in pose one and exhaling in pose two. Maybe you're building them up in a ladder flow and then retracing your steps. Maybe it's all about the arm or the neck variations. Maybe your focus is on the feet today and your hips next week. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time. You can use the same series of poses and make it a totally different embodied experience for students if you just get a little bit playful about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And for those of you who are new teachers, I recommend coming up with a framework sequence that you teach for a
Yes.
while and following a lot of the suggestions we've talked about in this episode of just finding small little things to shift and tweak. And it could be interjecting more breath cues or,
Hmm.
more philosophical cues or more body
More silence.
awareness or silence, right? And
Hmm.
so there's so many different ways that you can reuse those sequences. I think you'll find that it won't even feel like the same class in many ways. And that familiarity that students do feel will be welcomed. And so, yeah, totally agree
Yeah.
completely.
And I also think we talked about that Venn diagram of, teaching what you have some knowledge or expertise in, teaching what you yourself are passionate about, but also being guided by what your students need and what your students are interested in. So you do want to have your students' needs and preferences and likes as a compass, but you can't live and die by that. You're never going to create the perfect sequence that speaks equally to every single person in the room. So you can't let your emotions get swayed by this week somebody's saying, oh my God, I love that class. And next week somebody leaving early, or nobody saying that they love the class. You have to have an internal compass of your own feeling as a teacher of sharing the things that you think are important, drip feeding them in over time and trusting that over time the students will get all of the information that they need, kind of trusting the practice itself takes the pressure off every week having to be this pinnacle experience. It's not realistic and it's not going to serve you as a teacher.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And remembering that the people who come back will continue to learn. And,
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily need to have everything in there all the time. And I do want to listen to people's feedback, but I don't want to let it drive me too much, because what I'm trying to do is draw people to me who are similar and like-minded. I am not trying to please everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, I know that I cannot please everyone, and a group class can never, ever, ever, ever be an individualized practice. And so I find it really challenging. I mean, I know some people love to ask at the beginning of class what people want, and that can be nice if you have a smaller class and maybe you can add in just one little pose here and there for that one thing. Um, but even with that one person asking for hip stuff, maybe the other person's going to need something different and wants to, and again, there's really no way to please everyone. So I think as a teacher, that's the first thing you have to let go of is, you're never going to have a class that's perfect for everyone. But what you want to do is have some consistency between your classes that fits the description of the class that they're
Yes.
coming to, so that you can draw those people to you and have a group of people who appreciate the diversity of things that you do each week, if it's very different, or if it's really familiar to appreciate that as well. So yeah, I think feedback is really helpful, but I'm always, as a teacher, reflecting on how much I want to take that in,
Yeah.
because what I'm teaching is really what's really meaningful and purposeful to me, and then drawing those people toward me. So
Yeah, I think about this as the gap between stimulus and response. And there should be, for you as a teacher, that gap always, whether the feedback is great or neutral or negative. You want to create space between that feedback and your reaction to it so that you take the information in, you let it percolate, and you decide what of it is important or relevant. And obviously, if you're getting the same feedback all the time from the majority of your students, then that's information. But you can't let every single piece pull you one way and then pull you another.
mm,
Yeah,
yeah. And I think so much of the feedback we get is really positive, but even when you do
usually.
get, I mean, there's always everyone as teachers, and maybe the student didn't feel like it was meant to be negative. Maybe they've said something that they thought was really just constructive. And,
Hmm.
as teachers, because we put it all out there, it can be hard to take sometimes. And so I think what you're saying is really important, because if I have this buffer, I'm again assessing, like, is this helpful feedback to me to grow as a teacher, or is this person just needing a different class than I'm offering? And
Yeah,
for me, I think that's a really powerful point to then, like, recommend a class they might enjoy in a way that is really just there to try and help them find what's best for them, because I know that I can't please and help everyone, and that there is something out there for everyone. So that's the beauty of
yeah,
yoga
I love
today.
that.
Everyone can
And
find what
that,
they need. Yeah.
yes. Yeah, it gives you so much freedom as a teacher is you don't have to be the be all for everyone. There's something for that person somewhere, whether it's in person in your local area or online. It doesn't have to be you. And that I think is great for everybody. More options work for everyone. So,
Yeah.
any
Because the last
other
thing you
tips?
wanna do is be, like, having that person coming, encouraging them to come back, and then
Yes,
thinking
yes.
about that negative feedback and trying to please them, and then having these other students that are coming for you and this thing that you've been doing, and now you're
Hmm.
shifting what you're doing to try and please. You can imagine how that situation
The
can go.
hamster
So
wheel. You're just running,
yeah.
running, 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 not getting anywhere.
Stick to what you love, stick to what you know. Think about the triad we talked about, what you're good at, what you love, what the world needs from you, what your students need from you, um, and have fun. We're here to
Yeah.
serve our communities, so we're ultimately here to do the best that we can. Um, Listen and take feedback, but also find what's important to us as yoga teachers. There's so much out there now. We don't have to do it all, so we can just find our lane and enjoy it.
And you'll see a lot of these themes referenced in the sequencing training. We'll talk about timing and how to massage your timing. We talk quite a bit about picking a focal point and a theme and finding ways to explore and extrapolate that in your class. We talk about creating well-rounded sequences and emphasizing usefulness and relevance to your theme over it being fancy and new, and lots of other tips and tidbits. So we'll link to that in the show notes for anyone who wants to join in the live intake with office hours calls by live stream in January and February. And I'll link to a couple of sequencing related articles too to help you dive in.
And those roll around every so often. So if you do miss that, if you're listening to this later on, if you do the course online, the Evergreen course, you do have an opportunity to join those live calls when they come up live again, so you can have that support. I think having this framework is so helpful for so many teachers to have a framework to sequence by. I know for myself, when I, started moving from more of like a set sequence like Ashtanga and some of these other, this was a very, very long time ago, but, into a vinyasa territory, it can feel like such an ocean of information and so overwhelming sometimes to try and find our way. And I really think having some framework and some kind of strategy to your sequencing can be so helpful. Obviously, the tips we gave you today can be a really great starting point, but if you want more resources, we've got them. And of course, more resources to come on the podcast. I hope this has been
sure
helpful.
We'll talk about sequencing again, for sure.
Yes.
Brilliant.
So I think we hit all the main points and got through it all. Awesome.
Yeah. We'll link to some helpful resources, and hopefully that gives you some starting points to make sequencing a bit less stressful and a bit more enjoyable and fulfilling.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again. Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.